Hello and welcome to the fifth in the series of these 6 lectures. The title of the lecture today is Melancholia. This is going to be a slightly unusual lecture for 2 reasons. Firstly, although I have been trying in my other lectures to try to relate this to contemporary developments in terms of AI, AR, VR, and so on, technological developments, there's not going to be any explicit reference to them today, aside from the fact that what I'm trying to get at is what is behind the kind of images that I've been putting on these posters. These are all my own images. They're generated using Midjourney version 5.1. And I personally believe that the purpose behind these technologies is, or the real potential behind these technologies is really to explore different forms of expression. There are plenty of people who use Midjourney for jokes, to make sort of rather amusing puns and so on. There are plenty of people who use it for rather strange things like doing sections and so on. I'm just interested in the straightforward way in which we can somehow evoke and establish a new aesthetic through this medium. And I think some of the results that certainly I've been getting, and others as well, that you can find on Instagram are really quite remarkable. So if you want to see some of my images, my Instagram handle, my address is Neil Leach, Neil-Leach 14. The other reason why this is maybe a little bit different to the other lectures is that it is engaging with the world of philosophy. It's engaging primarily with the work of Julia Kristeva. But it's also addressing art. Rather than architecture, I'm going to be looking at least to begin with, I'm going to be looking at 2 remarkable artists and trying to unpick what lay behind their art. And both of them are distinguished by the fact they suffer, shall we say, from somewhat unusual kind of mental disturbances, which in its relationship to their art is, I will leave up to you to decide. But anyway, I will also, maybe the third reason this is going to be, why this lecture is going to be slightly unusual, is I'm going to rely on videos a lot. I think the videos are useful because they convey a lot. I think text is not so helpful, especially for Chinese students. And these are some really quite remarkable and astonishing videos I'll be showing. In fact, the whole thing, the whole lecture, I think is going to be quite powerful. So just to say, the purpose behind this series, for those who haven't seen any of these sessions before, is really to address the role of the image. Is the obsession within architectural culture, and that's probably refers also to other aesthetic realms such as art, design, and so on. Is this obsession with images a good thing or a bad thing? And the first 2 lectures in this series were addressing the book, The Anesthetics of Architecture, which offer a very negative critique about these images, talking about what is lost when we focus on images, what is lost in the whole process of aestheticization. The final 4 lectures, of which this is the third, are taking a much more nuanced, more dialectical, a more hopefully subtle approach towards images, and trying to redeem something, and trying to argue in some way they are something that they have a role in connecting us to the life world. They have a social role, an important social role. So, and these are the first 2 that we had, reality and aestheticization, and these are the final 4. Melancholia today will connect with many of the themes that we've been talking about in the previous 2 sessions, mimesis and life and death, and also will feed into the session on melancholia on belonging tomorrow. So this is the book Anesthetics, which was deliberately written as a rather sort of short and pithy polemical book. It was a manifesto. It was a critique of images coming out of an era of postmodernism, whereas Camouflage is a much more subtle book, a longer book, a more complex book, much more deeply theoretical in some senses, but also maybe to some extent inaccessible. It doesn't pull its punches. This is a deep fried theory, as my friends in Hong Kong call it, my French friends, Laurent and Valerie. It's like the theory version, let's say, of fish and chips. But I'm not going to apologize for it. So I want to, I just mention briefly the names. I know that it's difficult to pick up on names, and I can't always put them into the slides. So just to mention, I'm going to start off by looking at Yayoi Kusama and Francesca Woodman, who are both artists. Francesca Woodman no longer around. And then I'm going to engage with a series of theorists, some of whom we've mentioned before. Julia Kristeva, we haven't mentioned, but there I would say there's also a Digital Futures Doctoral Consortium session on Julia Kristeva that took place a few months ago. Sigmund Freud, we've mentioned, and Jacques Lacan also. Georges Bataille is someone new we haven't mentioned at all, but he's part of the whole lineup, shall we say, in rethinking architecture. And finally, Theodor Adorno, who was central to our session yesterday. In terms of the themes, I'm not structuring it quite so rigidly today, but these are the terms of the themes and some of the terms that are being used, many of them from Kristeva's own work: melancholia, abjection, mimesis, that was the subject of yesterday's session, eros and thanatos, death, sacrifice, the thetic crisis, which is a new one, eros versus agape, and ecstasy. So these are just simply the words, the terms that I will be referring to, and this is how you spell them. So I'm going to start off with a remarkable Japanese artist who is possibly the most famous living artist, certainly the most famous female living artist. Her name is Yayoi Kusama. And I've got a series of clips here from a documentary or a piece about her, and I'm going to play them there. They're not so long, but I think they give an important impression about this particular individual. Let me just say from the outset that she is, although she is probably the most famous artist in the world today, she spends her evenings, she spends her evenings in a mental asylum. She has voluntarily been part of this, whereas she's under medication during every night, and during the day she goes to her studio. She's also extremely famous for her polka dots. You will recognize her from some of these images. She is really quite an astonishing phenomenon, and I'm only going to talk about her art and her mental condition. But there are many other aspects of her life. She's a performance artist and a very important voice in feminism and so on. Let me play this.
At the age of 10, Yayoi Kusama had her first hallucination, which she described as flashes of light, auras, or dense fields of dots. The dots would come to life and consume her, and she would find herself obliterated. Polka dots have been a lifelong obsession for her. For someone whose work has crossed from art to fashion and from filmmaking to performance art, her continuing exploration of the polka dot has remained the one consistent motif. So this is not a film about a specific artwork. This is a film about the simple polka dot, a dot that has obsessed Kusama for 9 decades. From her struggle for recognition to her later years as an art world sensation.
So just to, mention briefly, the term hallucination was being used here, and maybe hallucination as such could be compared to how the world of augmented reality works. With hallucination, you see the world, but also you see other objects in that world. But it's not referring to the hallucination that we mentioned before, the controlled hallucinations that Anil Seth writes about in terms of how we perceive the world. Nor is it relating to the other forms of hallucinations that we've spoken about, the AI-generated hallucinations. But secondly, I want to pick up on this question of obliteration. This will be how you get absorbed by something and how you obliterate yourself. This question would also be central to the work of Francesca Woodman that I'll show shortly.
But art was Kusama's lifeline. It helped relieve her hallucinations, depression, and anxiety, which she still suffers from today. Kusama has described how at times she feels her whole body functions breaking down, with feelings of becoming absorbed by or dissolved within her surrounding environment. art is a way for her to take back control, a way to fight her demons.
So let me just say, there you have it. Art becomes a way of fighting her demons. And what I want to pick up on is the theory of melancholia that Julia Kristeva speaks about, and which how artists themselves draw upon melancholia in some senses in generating the work, but then art itself becomes a way of overcoming their melancholia. Absorption, too, will be a key theme, as you'll see shortly.
The field of dots she experienced in her hallucinations developed into a visual device, the polka dot. This image of her mother by 10-year-old Kusama was the first time she would use the dot, and it would become her trademark. We could make a comparison with Roy Lichtenstein, who was also using dots, or Bridget Riley, who was exploring op art. But for Kusama, dots came directly from within. For her, dots were a form of healing, and repetition of them was a way to calm her mind and overcome her fear and anxiety. They were, as she said, a way to self-obliterate.
Again, we have this notion of obliteration. I also think the term that the repetition is important. This is often used in psychoanalysis as a way of working through particular problems. And of course, art is also used as a kind of therapy in that domain.
In 1973, Kusama returned to Japan, where she was virtually unknown and dismissed. Then in 1977, after a lifetime of fighting anxiety and hallucinations, she checked herself into a psychiatric hospital in Tokyo and has lived there ever since. Kusama has been open about her mental health and remains on medication to prevent depression and suicidal thoughts. Every single day, she commutes to her studio and works obsessively on her paintings from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m.
I think that's the point. The whole story, it was in that clip. What wasn't, I haven't mentioned before though, was that she'd spent some time in the States. She actually wrote to Georgia O'Keeffe, the artist, and who put her in touch with a number of contacts. And in fact, eventually she did make it in the States, although she arrived there with absolutely nothing. And she became very prominent in the States in the anti-Vietnam War movement as well.
Many artists have famously struggled with their mental health, and like them, it is impossible to separate the art of Yayoi Kusama from her mental health. But why should we? Artists like Kusama make us question our understanding of mental illness and see it not as an obstacle, but as just another part of the human condition. These infinite repetitive works were originally designed to eliminate Kusama's intrusive thoughts. But now, as viewers, we can experience a small part of her thoughts and feelings in the physical endlessness of Kusama's world.
So what I want to argue too is not only does it help us rethink the question of mental illness, I also want to suggest that it actually can help us understand the whole nature of artistic production itself. Let me move on then to the second artist, a photographer, Francesca Woodman. I used her photographs in Camouflage. I got a Graham Foundation grant, and I approached her parents for permission to use her photographs. I've mentioned these before, and I think they're exquisitely beautiful for all sorts of reasons. But what I wanted to add today is that when her parents replied to me, they said, "Well, can you send me a sample of the book?" And I had been working on this for some time, and I kind of began to realize, I think I know why Francesca Woodman committed suicide. And this is the important aspect of Francesca Woodman. She threw herself from the top of a building at the age of, in her early 20s, in something like 1981, I think it was. So we tragically lost someone hugely talented, We tragically lost some, and I always see her as the Sylvia Plath of American photography. Sylvia Plath was a writer, a poet, a remarkably good poet. Sylvia Plath had come over to the UK to study at Newnham College in Cambridge. She subsequently got married to Ted Hughes. That fell apart, and she found herself in a desperate situation, living in a small apartment, a small flat, as they say in England, in South London. And eventually things got too much for her. At the time, she had produced some astonishing poetry, absolutely amazing poetry, some of the best poetry that anyone has ever written. And arguably, it might have come out of her condition, out of that situation. At any rate, she committed suicide. She switched the gas on in the oven, and we no longer have Sylvia Plath. Of course, Sylvia Plath had already written about her mental struggles in The Bell Jar, a novel, that autobiographical novel that she wrote before producing most of her poetry. But anyway, Francesca Woodman, her work survives, and it was the theme that I chose for Camouflage, largely because I could see her kind of the way in which she was blending into a building, in which she was using here this fish skeleton here, which is somehow relating to the herringbone reinforcement in the plasterwork, in the stucco. And I thought I knew at the time what the problem was. I could see, and when I've been writing about Melancholia, I could see all this. I could see the problems of narcissism and so on from my book. So when her parents asked me to send a text, I sent them the nicest one. I sent them the first chapter of Mimesis with Walter Benjamin, talking about being transported into another world in the kind of Alice through the looking glass way that I was talking about in our session on Mimesis. Anyway, these are some of the photographs, and by watching a documentary on the Woodmans, a very, very good documentary on the Woodmans, and just today, I think I've really discovered something really quite important. What I thought was happening here is maybe not quite what was happening. But I certainly was taking the theme that this wrapping yourself in wallpaper, this getting lost in your surroundings, was a fundamental part of her mental condition as much as her artwork itself. And they're all taken of herself. They're all about herself, self-portraits. And that itself may also speak about something in terms of her condition. But here she is, hiding behind the fireplace, like a child playing hide and seek, getting lost, as it were, in her architectural surroundings, becoming building. And I use that as a metaphor, as it were, throughout the book. So although the book was not about physically camouflaging yourself in your surroundings, it was about thinking your way into your surroundings. How could you, as it were, become absorbed, become connected, become attached to the built environment in which you operate, or indeed the environment as a whole? And here we see her wearing a kind of camouflage dress with her friend against the kind of the flowers in the background, camouflaged against those flowers. Or indeed here with the angel. And again, the theme of narcissism, the theme of the mirror, has again been central to the work that she was doing. And I wondered to what extent that might explain some aspects of her work, and indeed her own personal identity. Then at one point, I did not need to translate the notes. They went directly to my hands. And this actually I found out from the documentary. I'm going to show you exactly what happened. It was using flour. And I didn't realize this. Anyway, there we go. Being an angel. So let me show you this documentary. It's about 10 minutes, 12, well, it's like an excerpt from an hour and a half. It's about 12 minutes long, but I think it's fascinating. So I will play it in its totality.
Disappear as a representation of her state of mind when she was hiding behind a scrap of wallpaper. It was her making a parallel How would it be to be that peeling paint or wallpaper? How does the human form relate to it? You put yourself in it.
Okay. I've
a person with a perhaps unusual history.
She didn't have a depression or a neurosis of that nature. I'd say she had a neurosis, but more of a committed, passionate one towards taking pictures, and then a very fragile interior. She's a fragile person, and it caused her to make beautiful pictures.
No, I don't think either one of us thought, well, you know, this child is psychologically disturbed. She's depressed. She's what's going on? No.
No.
The pictures are pictures of a healthy person who's looking at a fragile interior. The pictures are results of keeping very busy, committed to art. And therefore, I'd say her healthiest years. So taking the pictures were all healthy years. The process was a blast.
A truck carrying flour overturned on the street, and flour was all over the place, and which she filled up in a bucket and brought into her studio.
Some people look at this and what she's doing here as, oh, it's about absence and it's about, you know, it's somehow painful. And I see what she's doing here. She had this idea. They got all this flour. She did it and it worked. And she's thrilled. She's pleased. And that's, you know, that's Francesca. It's not about loss. It's about, look what I did. That's what art making is about, as far as I'm concerned.
She would be saddled with a great sense of her accomplishments and her abilities, at the same time with a great sense of it's not good enough. I'm not, my work isn't what it should be. I'm not pushing ahead sufficiently.
I think for Francesca, a lot of it depended on how quickly she could equal her parents as an artist. And my guess is it wasn't fast enough for her.
September 1980. She was very distressed.
We said, well, you should try to see a therapist. I'm not sure the therapist took her seriously enough. Who knows what the story was. She tried to commit suicide at her apartment.
Dear Slow Plum, after 3 weeks and weeks and weeks of thinking about it, I finally managed to try to do away with myself as neatly and concisely as possible. I do have standards, and my life at this point is like very old coffee sediment, and I would rather die young, leaving various accomplishments, some work, my friendship with you, and some other artifacts intact, instead of pell-mell erasing all of these delicate things.
We went over there and, you know, got the fire department, broke the door down, took her to the hospital. But then, you know, she appeared to be better.
after that first suicide attempt, she did call me. And I was clear that she was unhappy and had been for a while, and worried about her. And she said, "I'm not taking pictures." And that was alarming. Someone who you'd spent so much time with taking pictures wasn't taking pictures. I think that one statement alarmed me more than anything else.
We had a couple of months or so living in terror with her. And in the beginning, when she first attempted suicide, she wanted to do, that's what she wanted to do again. So she was first here, but just constantly, someone had to be constantly with her.
She was clearly not well, very distressed, and we seemed to be able to do nothing particularly to help her. And I just think things unraveled.
She came to my apartment for a dinner party, and there were half a dozen people, and I just looked at this photograph, and here are all of us kind of clowning for the camera, and everybody's sort of clustered together looking at the camera, and Francesca is leaning over the edge of the couch away from the rest of the group with this kind of haunted, sad face.
Francesca was missing. We couldn't find her. So we were concerned. I mean, she called, she said she was not feeling very well again. The psychotherapist had thought that maybe it would help her to take some kind of antidepressant drug. She was taking it. She was feeling better. She decided with our approval that she would go and live in her own apartment again and not be here sort of under our constant eye. I mean, and she went home, and I think what happened was she stopped taking the drugs, got very depressed, and just felt that as she wrote down, her life felt like a stale cup of coffee and wasn't worth living.
She had a bad day. She had hopes of getting this NEA grant, which may not be realistic hopes, but she had plenty hopes.
Well, she didn't know she didn't get it.
Well, she knew.
She knew
she found out she didn't get it, and she had a bicycle stolen.
Yeah, her
the same
bicycle
day.
was
That was just a
stolen.
crappy day.
Francesca came over to babysit, and I knew that she was in a very withdrawn state. And I more than once I remember saying, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I just am getting the flu."
I called Bob Kushner, was a painter friend of ours. He was sort of irritated that, why were we sort of staying so on top of Francesca? No, she wasn't there. She'd been there, but she said she didn't feel well and she'd gone off.
I'll tell you what I think happened. This, that she left our house, tried to call a number of people, couldn't call, couldn't get through to people, tried and left a number of messages for the man she was seeing. Couldn't reach him. And then according to George, came back to the building next to us, which was a public building, went up to the roof and jumped off.
We got a telephone call from a psychotherapist. And the psychotherapist said, she's missed her appointment. I'm very worried about her. So this started a frantic search, which didn't yield anything until police yielded something.
Body taken to the morgue, no ID. And the reason it took so long was the face was not recognizable. He identified her through her clothing.
It became very confusing, a situation rather like Shock and rather like a second-rate grade B movie. This isn't real, you're in a movie. The cops are taking you to the morgue, et cetera, et cetera. Those things happen in movies, they don't happen in my life. I didn't think they ever would.
You'd like to blame somebody. You'd like to blame yourself. You would like not to blame yourself, or you'd like to blame somebody who's, being cruel to Francesca, but I just don't think you can do that. I think it might comfort you to do it for a few minutes, but I don't think you can do that. And I don't think either one of us can go through life blaming ourselves.
So that's very powerful. At least I found it very powerful. I've been communicating by email with her parents, whom you see here. The book was published in 2006. I think I've been communicating in 2003 or something, or 4. In any case, this documentary wasn't produced until 2010, so I hadn't seen it when the book was published. And I wonder whether these thoughts are correct. I guess the only person who really knew what was happening was Francesca Woodman, and maybe she didn't fully understand what was going on. Was it about the fact I'm particularly not sure about whether in fact she wasn't trying to self-obliterate in some way, a little like Yayoi Kusama was. Is there a connection between these two? Could we do a study looking at the relationship between them in terms of mental health and art production? In any case, we have two artists, both hugely talented. One succeeded in committing suicide and one succeeded in surviving. But I think between them, they tell us a lot, not just about mental health, but also about art production itself. So let's get to the lecture itself with that as a kind of rather extended introduction to look at the theme of melancholia. I want to start by picking up on some of the thoughts about life and death that we've been talking about in the last couple of days. And I want to start with this image of a fetus, a child in the womb, and just reflect on some of the thoughts that Freud had about this situation. I mean, first of all, let me say, this is probably the first experience of architecture that any of us have ever had. The enclosure, the womb of the mother, that is this incredible protective membrane. And in here, as the child is, as it were, floating in a sea of amniotic fluid, being fed by the mother and kept warm by the mother, it's a state of paradise, at least according to Freud. Freud refers to this condition as the nirvana of the womb. And then a disaster happens when at one point we are suddenly ejected from this paradise. We are ejected into a world where it is cold, where we have to keep ourselves warm, we have to feed ourselves, We have to write essays, we have to do work, we have to, in order to survive, and so on and so on and so on. It's a hostile world. And according to Freud, all subsequent life is premised on the regressive, the aggressive idea of returning to the nirvana of the womb. All subsequent life is premised on the idea or the hope to return to the nirvana of the womb. In other words, life and death are in some senses connected in some way. It is about a return. And that theme of life and death, of things becoming dead, things becoming alive, is something we've touched upon in this series. The contrast between Medusa and Daedalus. Medusa, whose face will turn you into stone if you look directly at it. Then Daedalus, supposedly the first architect who had the capacity to produce sculptures so realistic that they came to life, in some senses, both referring to a kind of architectural metaphor. And we also thought about how the notion of life and death is in itself dialectically connected. As Slavoj Žižek points out in what is, I think, the most interesting example, he makes the distinction, or makes the connection, shall we say, not the distinction, between a still photograph and a movie or a video. And the point being, we always think that these are separate. The still image is very different from the animated movie, but actually they are dialectically connected, because what is a still photograph but a frozen moment taken out of an animated continuum, and what is a movie or a film than a series of these frozen moments literally stitched together. So this theme of life and death is something that I'm going to pick up again in this particular lecture. And I'm going to do it through the thinking of Julia Kristeva, a French intellectual, feminist, psychoanalytic thinker, philosopher, originally from Bulgaria, but now a French citizen. When I was teaching in Columbia, I went to her seminars, not all of them, but many of them, and I was astounded by the precision of her thinking, the tidiness, the neatness, a very elegantly dressed French lady, but also thinking in a very, very, very elegant way. And her preoccupations are to do with the theme of art, of love, and of religion. And circling around this, the theme of objection becomes central, as does the theme of melancholia. She picks up on this particular painting, and it's of Holbein's Dead Christ, and she makes this particular comment. The chest bears the bloody mark of a spear, and the hand shows the stigmata of the crucifixion, which stiffen the outstretched middle finger. Imprints of nails mark Christ's feet. The martyr's face bears the expression of hopeless grief. The empty stare, the sharp line profile, the dull blue-green complexion are those of a man who is truly dead, of Christ, forsaken by the Father. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And without the promise of the resurrection. So you can see in this photo, you can see here, this is the rigor mortis setting into the finger and the various marks on the body of Christ. Now, Julia Kristeva's view is that Christianity has an important role to play in the way that it ritualizes the whole process of life and death. For Christians, of course, the death of Christ is what gives us life. They are themselves always already connected. But the point that Julia Kristeva makes is actually loss or death, as it is in psychoanalysis, is an important thing. It leads to the kind of, it allows us to kind of move on, to identify and so on. And importantly, the ritual that goes on in the Catholic or Christian Mass of the death of Christ, of reenacting in some senses every single service the death of Christ and the rebirth, as it were, it has an effect on those who are there as a form of kind of reinvigoration. You come out of that reinvigorated through the process of identifying, not literally, but symbolically identifying with Christ's death. It is therefore has a very powerful role to play in Christian religions. And this is what I make a comment on in my book, Camouflage. Although the painting is about death and loss, it hints at a close affinity between the work of art and loss, as articulated through death, to the point where this affinity serves to highlight and reinforce the role of art as a mechanism whose purpose is to transcend death. The role of art as a mechanism whose purpose is to transcend death. And as I mentioned in our last session about this, the theme of death, the theme of sacrifice runs throughout. You do a kind of an anthropological study throughout history, you will find many myths and stories about making a sacrifice in order to make a building stand out. This one, which I mentioned before, Master Manol, who was building the Black Church, and it keeps on collapsing until he has a dream at night, and it's God telling him, if you build your wife into the wall will stand up. And of course it does, but she dies, and he himself actually doesn't, for different other reasons, we're going to go into now, doesn't survive. And this theme of sacrifice, therefore, is seen as, when seen symbolically, is seen to be a kind of positive thing in a way. I mean, that's not to say that sacrifice itself can be very, very negative. Clearly, if someone is sacrificed, they lose their life, of course. But this is a comment from Kristeva. Sacrifice has been viewed as an unleashing of animal violence, a commemoration of pre-human bestiality. But in our opinion, classical anthropological sociology has a more accurate view, assigning sacrifice an ambiguous function, simultaneously violent and regulatory. For sacrifice designates precisely the watershed on the basis of which the social and the symbolic are instituted. The thetic that confines violence to a single place, making it a signifier. I'll explain the term thetic in a moment. Far from unleashing violence, sacrifice shows how representing that violence is enough to stop it and concatenate that order. And we mentioned also in our session about Lacan and about how, in a sense, as you develop, you have to, in some sense, sacrifice, leave behind the mother, this important moment, the mirror stage, when the child recognizes itself as not being part of the mother, but rather an object in a world of object, what Lacan describes as an alienating identification. But it's precisely by recognizing that it is alone that the child is able then to forge secondary forms of identification. You have to, as it were, murder the mother. You have to leave the mother in order to start forming forms of secondary identification. The thetic but this is me again describing the thetic crisis. What do we mean by the thetic crisis? What does Kristeva mean by the thetic crisis? By thetic crisis, Kristeva means boundary failure, a crisis that is of individual subjectivity. The crisis prompts the reenactment of an earlier moment of identity creation, the moment when the subject rejects the mother in the struggle for a separate identity. For Kristeva, this amounts to a mimetic crisis, a crisis, that is to say, of non-differentiation. In order to establish a separate identity, the subject must effectively murder the mother. In other words, if we're just part of this in an undifferentiated totality, we have no sense of our own identity. And without our sense of a separate identity, we cannot forge relationships as such. And Kristeva talks about this in the context of a discussion about melancholia. Now, she's not referring to the historical notion of melancholia, one of the four biles that throughout kind of from medieval history onwards was seen as an important part of understanding how the body operates. And melancholia had been recognized. She's rather referring to the more contemporary understanding of melancholia, something that it seems afflicts many poetic and artistic people. It's as though it is deeply connected with artistic connection. And the way that Kristeva sees this melancholia is in the sense that when you're an artist, you have to sort of, in some sense, withdraw inside yourself, and draw inside yourself to kind of to draw out something from that. And that, in a sense, is in a way mimicking the whole notion of melancholia, of being kind of introverted in some sense. And that's what allows you to produce the artwork. But the artwork also, in some senses, transcends melancholia. It is a way of breaking up, of connecting to the world outside and of breaking down the notion of melancholia. If artistic expression offers the possibility of transcending death, then melancholia, a form of living death, represents the opposite pole. Artistic expression may open up and restore the subject, whereas melancholia threatens to close off the subject and deny the possibility of access to the outside world. In their responses, the artist and the melancholic opt for two diametrically opposite positions, and yet, according to Kristeva, the two remain dialectically related. To continue, not only do artistic expression and melancholia share common origins, but the one may serve to counter the other. While the artist always threatens to be melancholic, the melancholic may seek relief through art. The message in Kristeva is that art is born of, but also transcends melancholia. In a sense, the artist has to withdraw inside the self to become, as it were, melancholic in order to produce the work, but then the work itself allows that artist to break free and to connect with the external world. Let me also introduce the Caravaggio's Narcissus, another theme that we've spoken about in the past. And of course, as we've mentioned, this is a story about a young youth who is punished for spurning the advances of I think it's Eros and Echo, and he's punished by the gods by making him fall in love with his own reflection. Whether or not he knows it's his own reflection, I don't know. But the story is that he goes out hunting and he comes back thirsty and goes to drink from a pool, and then sees his reflection and falls in love with his reflection. And then he is fixated by this and he turns into stone and dies. Then from that stone, the narcissus flower arises. Well, for Freud, narcissism is a very negative thing. It's a kind of, it's a failure to see the other in the other. You're closed off to the other. You're obsessed only with the self, and it has a certain sort of negative consequences. But others are not so negative about it. The point that's often made is that actually, that Narcissus is in a sense in a state of rapture. He is, as it were, lost. He is in the state of existential oneness at this moment of reflecting on and looking at his own reflection, which opens up a lot of interesting thoughts about the connection between this and the world of art. Another important distinction that Kristeva makes is between the notion of Eros, so commonly associated with Narcissus, a narcissistic kind of a self-centered form of love, and then what she calls agape. Agape is a term from the Greek, which is often referred to the kind of love that you get from religious devotion. Whereas Eros is a closed-off love, agape is about opening up to the other and identifying with the other. So let me quote myself again. When Kristeva refers to the connections between art and love, she has a particular form of love in mind. She is referring to agape, a higher form of love which enacts a union with God. Agape is more mystical than mere Eros, the common form of love. It is a selfless, charitable love. Agape is not desire. It involves an openness and identification with the other. So we get a connection here between art, love, and religion. And it's these three concepts that really structure Kristeva's own thought, especially in the context of Melancholia. So I want to move on to the second part of my presentation today, which is to say the theme not so much of Melancholia, but the theme of ecstasy. And in Camouflage, I have a chapter on ecstasy. And I want to refer here to a very, very famous sculpture by Bernini of St Teresa. It's in a church in Rome, and it's one of the most exquisitely beautiful paintings, one of the high points, I would say, of the Baroque. And what you see also, it's got some very beautiful lighting coming from above. What is interesting, though, about this sculpture is that it's Bernini's obviously interpretation of St. Teresa. St. Teresa was a nun and in some sense a religious mystic. And she was a founder of an order of nuns in Spain, but she's from Ávila in Spain. But she also recorded these so-called raptures or ecstasies, we might call them, that she had. These were religious ecstasies, but there's something deeply curious about the nature of these ecstasies. As you can see, here's the angel of the Lord, and here is an arrow that the angel of the Lord is about to plunge into St. Teresa, who is in this kind of almost helpless swoon. At least that's how it appears. This is how Bernini has interpreted it, and actually it follows quite closely from the writings of St. Teresa herself. So there's the angel of the Lord, there's the arrow, and St. Teresa at this moment in this kind of swoon, a remarkably evocative statue of a remarkable situation. This is her text. In his hands I saw a long golden spear, and at the iron tip there appeared to be a point of fire. This he plunged into my heart several times, so it penetrated to my entrails. When he pulled it out, I felt that he took them with him. Sorry, but when he pulled it out, I felt that he took them out with him, and left me utterly consumed by the great love of God. The pain was so severe that it made me utter several moans. The sweetness caused by this intense pain is so extreme that one cannot possibly wish it to cease, nor is one's soul then content with anything but God. This is not a physical, but a spiritual pain, though the body has some share in it, even a considerable share. So gentle is this wooing which takes place between God and the soul, that if anyone thinks that I'm lying, I pray God in his goodness to grant him some experience of this. In Lacanian terms, this is what's referred to as jouissance, and I'll talk about that a little more later. It is the bittersweet moment of aesthetic recollection that somehow echoes, for example, the work of Rilke, where he refers to angels being terrifying. Jeder Engel ist schrecklich. The idea somehow you're combining the sublimely beautiful with the shocking in some way. And it's this moment of jouissance that one connects only at this moment, according to Lacan. Do you connect with the real, as it were, with a capital R? One seems to, and this is where the kind of theme of death and life comes out again. One seems to be on the point of death. Only the agony carries with it so great a joy that I do not know of any proper comparison. It is a harsh yet sweet martyrdom. Yet at the same time, this pain is so sweet, and the sound is so conscious of its value, and the soul is so conscious of its value that it now desires this suffering more than all of the gifts that it used to receive. It believes this to be the safest state too, because it is the way of the cross. And in my opinion, it contains a joy of exceeding worth, because the body has no part in it but agony, whereas the soul, even while suffering, rejoices in the bliss and contentment that this suffering brings. So I want to show you a couple of clips from a movie about St. Teresa. The movie was produced by a filmmaker called Nina Danino, who was teaching at Goldsmiths in London at the time, teaching filmmaking. And she gave a lecture about this at the Architectural Association in London, invited by Mark Cousins. So let me just play it. It's based totally on this particular sculpture.
Into ruin and decay. Distressed as I was, I forced myself to be active, and though in losing him, I was losing all the good and comfort in my life, for he was all that to me. I was so determined not to show my grief that I behaved as if I felt none at all. But I felt as if my soul were being torn from my body when I saw his life depart, for I was very fond of him. That night, I had an attack which left me insensible for almost 4 days. They gave me the sacrament of extreme unction. At times, they were so sure that I was dead that afterwards I actually found some wax on my eyelids. For a day and a half, a grave was left open, and the rites for the dead were performed. After, I was in such a state that my tongue was bitten to pieces, and my throat was so choked that I could not even swallow water. My bones seemed to be wrenched out of their sockets, and there was a great confusion in my head. I could no more move arm, foot, or hand than if I had been dead. All that I could move, I think, was one finger of my right hand. The fainting fits are now very rare, and I am free from the contraction of my nerves during the paralysis and the attacks of fever, though I suffer from morning sickness and cannot take any food until past midday, sometimes not till much later. Now that I take communion more frequently, I have to bring it on at night before I go to bed, with feathers or in some other way, and I think this is much more disturbing. I think I'm never quite free from aches and pains, which are sometimes very severe, especially around the heart. We spoke so freely about this and of other things that on the next morning she remarked to me, "How I forgot myself last night. These desires and this love of mine made me lose all sense of proportion." I found myself dying of this desire, this love. It came to me in mighty impulses. Nothing gave me satisfaction, and I could not contain myself. When these impulses come on me, I exert all my strength to resist, because I am afraid of delusions. This desire grows so intense that its extreme distress robs the soul of all consciousness. It seems to be on the point of death, fainting almost completely away in a kind of swoon. Her breath and all her bodily powers progressively fail. Her eyes close involuntarily. If you read in this state, you can scarcely make out a single letter. You hear, but only dimly, as if from far away. It is the same with the tongue. You cannot form nor have the strength to pronounce a single word. One can do absolutely nothing, only utter a few slight moans, not aloud, but inwardly out of pain. It is impossible to describe this wound, this very great but so sweet a pain. It is like being pierced to the depths of the entrails, or sometimes to the heart. It is like a voice crying out to take breath. I wish that someone would explain these death-like yearnings, tell me what they mean. Sometimes my pulse ceases to beat at all. All my longing at this time is to die. I forget everything in this longing, this abandonment, this loneliness. Into ruin and decay. Distressed as I was, I forced myself to be active, and though in losing him, I was losing all the good and comfort in my life, for he was all that to me, I was so determined not to show my grief, that I behaved as if I felt none at all. But I felt as if my soul were being torn from my body when I saw his life depart, for I was very fond of him. That night, I had an attack which left me insensible for almost 4 days. They gave me the sacrament of extreme unction. At times, they were so sure that I was dead that afterwards I actually found some wax on my eyelids. For a day and a half, a grave was left open, and the rites for the dead were performed. After, I was in such a state that my tongue was bitten to pieces, and my throat was so choked that I could not even swallow water. My bones seemed to be wrenched out of their sockets, and there was a great confusion in my head. I could no more move arm, foot, or hand than if I had been dead. All that I could move, I think, was one finger of my right hand. The fainting fits are now very rare, and I am free from the contraction of my nerves during the paralysis and the attacks of fever, though I suffer from morning sickness and cannot take any food until past midday, sometimes not till much later. Now that I take communion more frequently, I have to bring it on at night before I go to bed, with feathers or in some other way, and I think this is much more disturbing. I think I'm never quite free from aches and pains, which are sometimes very severe, especially around the heart. We spoke so freely about this and of other things that on the next morning she remarked to me, "How I forgot myself last night. These desires and this love of mine made me lose all sense of proportion." I found myself dying of this desire, this love. It came to me in mighty impulses. Nothing gave me satisfaction, and I could not contain myself. When these impulses come on me, I exert all my strength to resist, because I am afraid of delusions. This desire grows so intense that its extreme distress robs the soul of all consciousness. It seems to be on the point of death, fainting almost completely away in a kind of swoon. Her breath and all her bodily powers progressively fail. Her eyes close involuntarily. If you read in this state, you can scarcely make out a single letter. You hear, but only dimly, as if from far away. It is the same with the tongue. You cannot form nor have the strength to pronounce a single word. One can do absolutely nothing, only utter a few slight moans, not aloud, but inwardly out of pain. It is impossible to describe this wound, this very great but so sweet a pain. It is like being pierced to the depths of the entrails, or sometimes to the heart. It is like a voice crying out to take breath. I wish that someone would explain these death-like yearnings, tell me what they mean. Sometimes my pulse ceases to beat at all. All my longing at this time is to die. I forget everything in this longing, this abandonment, this loneliness.
I think I might have played this a second time by mistake.
I was thinking just now as I wrote this, that a verse which I have already quoted, Dilatatico meum, speaks of the heart being enlarged. I do not think that this happiness has its source in the heart at all. It arises in a much more interior part, like something of which the springs are very deep. Then I heard a very soft voice speaking to me in a whisper. All my hair stood on end with terror. He told me not to consider myself forgotten, for he would never abandon me, and that I must do everything in my power to help myself, and other things as well, that there is no need to repeat.
So what was interesting about this moment, this is that you could read this in many different sort of ways. This was a deeply religious moment. At the same time, it was something strange about it. And Jacques Lacan and Georges Bataille have both picked up on this and have made this particular comment. Lacan, I think, completely misunderstands this particular video. He sees it as though she, in this religious ecstasy, it's some kind of sexual enjoyment. And this is the comments he makes. It's like for St Teresa, you need but to go to Rome and see the statue by Bernini to immediately understand she's coming. There's no doubt about it. And Dylan Evans, who's a commentator on Lacan, describes jouissance, this moment that we're talking about. Jouissance is the path towards death, insofar as the drives are an attempt to break through the pleasure principle in search of jouissance. Every drive is a death drive. Now, jouissance is connected with sexual pleasure as well. I'll simply say that. But it seems to me Lacan has misunderstood this completely. And Georges Bataille then also comments on this. And he, on the first version of his book on eroticism, for some reason, the title changes from erotism to eroticism. On the first version, he includes a picture of St. Teresa. And he takes a bit more nuanced view. It is the desire to live while ceasing to live, or to die without ceasing to live, the desire of an extreme state that St. Teresa has perhaps been the only one to depict strongly enough in words. I die because I cannot die. But the death is not dying. The death of not dying is precisely not death. It is the ultimate stage of life. If I die because I cannot die, it is on condition that I live on. Because of the death I feel, though still alive and still live on. St. Teresa's being real, but did not actually die of her desire actually to experience the sensation. She lost her footing, but all she did was to live more violently. So violently that she could say that she was on the threshold of dying, but such a death as tried her to the utmost, though it did not make her cease to live. In other words, she almost died, but then she didn't die, and this death led to a form of life. And Bataille goes on. Erotic activity, by dissolving the separate beings that participate in, reveals their fundamental continuity, like the waves of a stormy sea. In sacrifice, a violent death disrupts the creature's discontinuity. What remains, what the tense onlookers experience in the succeeding silence, is the continuity of all existence, with which the victim is now one. And then poetry leads to the same place as all forms of eroticism, to the blending and fusion of separate objects. It leads us to eternity. It leads us to death, and through death to continuity. Poetry is eternity, the sun matched with the sea. And you can see by this kind of motifs that kind of repeat the concerns of Kristeva herself, how this poetry becomes a way of connecting, of losing the self, but connecting in some way and living on. It leads to eternity. It leads us to death, but through death to a continuity. In other words, ecstasy in some ways is a way of thinking about the different response to melancholia. Now, what does this mean in architectural terms? How could we begin to understand this kind of poetic impulse that we've laid out in the last few sessions? Well, Adorno who talks about this in terms of what he calls a sensuous correspondence. He's talking about this connection, between ourselves and the built environment in terms of a sensuous correspondence. He refers to this building on the left-hand side, Hans Scharoun's building, the Philharmonie, the Philharmonic Hall in Berlin, which is right next to and deeply contrasts with the building by Mies van der Rohe, the National Gallery. And inside, you can see this is very much part of this sort of organic tradition that we have from Germany, a free form, very sensuous free form. And that, in a sense, is what Adorno is talking about when he's referring to mimesis. And if I were to think of an architectural example of this, this was the one I mentioned yesterday, this idea of as the work of Zaha would be precisely also this kind of sensuous correspondence with the world that is enacted by this deeply poetic, deeply sensitive form of architectural expression. But the idea of somehow of life and death, you could also take it a different way. You could also take it, we can think of therefore of Eros and Thanatos, of Eros being the work of Zaha, the work of this more organic thing, and Thanatos being the kind of minimalism, the kind of the quiet, the resolution of tensions, as it were, that exists in modernist architecture. And interestingly, of course, the theme of death is written into architectural discourse. Some of you might have realized that the Vitruvian Man is actually very similar to the model of the crucifix of Christ. In fact, many crucifixes from the Renaissance were based on the logic of Vitruvius. And in some senses also, in the way the architecture somehow takes on this sense of the Christian sort of world. I read an article once called Vitruvius Crucifixus, Vitruvius crucified, pointing out the resemblances between the model of the Vitruvian Man and Christ on the cross. In other words, you can in some senses evoke this sense of through death to life, in some senses how the death or the resolution of tensions can itself then feed back into some flaring up of the imagination. Of course, there is the other model of Vitruvius, which is not often mentioned, where the notion of the erotic is very explicitly explained, shown in some ways. But it is this model that we have, that we see embedded, inscribed within the plans of Renaissance churches, that is the dominant one, where it literally becomes in the church itself as an embodiment, as a way of connecting to and seeking a resolution with the building itself. From that perspective, I think you could also see the work of David Chipperfield as being an example of this notion of mimesis. It is design is the issue. It's not a question whether it's organic or whether it's kind of rectilinear or modernist or something like that, but rather it is a question of design itself. And what you get through this kind of the quietness, as it were, this kind of architecture, is it doesn't lead to death. Rather, it leads to something else, an invigoration, a kind of a flaring up of the imagination that comes out of these two perspectives. So I would claim that it works in both ways. I want to now show you a video of a very beautiful video of the wasp and the orchid, which I often use to talk about the work of Gilles Deleuze, the idea of becoming, of how we can become like the world around us. And in some senses, what you have here is a wasp in an orchid that is, in some senses, housed by that orchid, at least temporarily. And what is interesting about this is that Deleuze is interested in the notion of becoming, how we can become like the world around us, and indeed how the world around us can become like us. So becoming like interactive design is a kind of two-way process. And what you're seeing here is on the one hand, the wasp is using or feeding off the orchid because it's getting nectar from the orchid. But at the same time, the orchid is using the wasp because, as you see, it's depositing pollen onto the back of the wasp. So once the wasp has gorged itself on a particular orchid and taken all the nectar, it then flies to another another orchid, and in that process cross-pollinates the orchids. In other words, the wasps are using the orchids because they're getting nectars from the orchids, but also the orchids are using the wasp because they're using them to cross-pollinate the different plants. And this is the process of becoming, of mutual becoming. It also speaks of a kind of connectivity, in a sense, in the world itself, of connections. And of course, Deleuze himself is a thinker of connections. John Rachman wrote a book called Connections in relation to Deleuze. And it seems to me this notion of becoming, of connecting in some ways, is an interesting one to think about in the context of a world in which not only do we have a more transitory nomadic existence, just like this wasp going from orchid to orchid, we ourselves are far more nomadic than we used to be, but also in terms of a society in which some of the systems of belonging, the logics of belonging, the logic of religious belief and the logic of the family are beginning to break down. Not only are fewer people religious these days, but the logic of divorce means that people don't remain connected. So in a transitory world, in a world of lack of connections, we can see the possibility of a kind of form of connectivity, a temporary connectivity, which can be evoked by the environment around us. And if we think about this in terms of an architecture, as it were, of the orchid, it gives us a sense of what possibility architecture might afford in terms of giving us a sense of belonging, a term that we will talk about more tomorrow. I want to just finish off with two brief comments. Hold on a second. Let me go back one. That wasn't working. Let me just go back a second and just hold on a second. I'm going to go and make sure I got that working. Sorry. Okay. That should be working. No, it's working. Okay. Let me just okay, let me just try again. A second. Let me try one more time. So that's just a brief clip, but what I wanted to show is the kind of form of self-transcendence you also get through religion. And of course, religion itself is highly dependent upon aesthetic, about the incense of in the church and the singing of the choir and so on. That actually was the choir from the school that I went to of monks, the Benedictine monks in the UK. They wore black and they had no money. What I find interesting about this kind of existence is their devotion was a form of agape. It was selfless kind of devotion. They were not interested in making money. They actually had no money at all. And it was a different form of existence. In fact, for them, they once told me that actually they didn't believe in the notion of possessions, rather that we only borrow things when we're alive. We don't actually own them. We have to give them up when we die. And art for Kristeva should be about this. It shouldn't be about money. It should be about love. It should be about making connections. It should be about self-transcendence and all this. So I want to just kind of then play you what I think is really a slightly perverse appropriation of the work of Kusama, a rather unfortunate one, where she has been appropriated, as it were, by the world of Louis Vuitton. This is in fact a statue of her, a sculpture, a moving, a robotic sculpture of her, where she's painting on the window of the Louis Vuitton shop front in New York. Now, it seems to me that this is really not what her work is about. Her work is about something completely different. It's about overcoming her mental condition, about connecting with the world, about losing herself, about being absorbed, about being obliterated. And it's primarily about that. Money really doesn't come into it. And so we get a complete mismatch when we find the world of art between the artists who are doing it from a form of love, to the people who buy the art, who see it as a form of investment. And Digital Futures is more the former. We're the ones who want to share our passion for the sake of that passion, not because of making money, but rather that everyone needs to share and know about all these things. But there's always the other side, the people will go through who are trying to basically make money out of this world. This seemed to me the crisis, as it were, in the world of art between the artists and the people who are exploiting the artists to make money out of this. Louis Vuitton bag is a long way from the work of Kusama. So let's wrap it up there. I apologize for some of the problems, the technical problems at the very beginning, but hopefully the sound resolved itself towards the end. And let's have some questions. If you've got any questions, please put them into the chat. If you're on the YouTube or Bilibili chat, please put them on there and we can relay them. Or indeed, if you're in the Zoom conversation, please put a comment in the chat. So how are we doing for time? Well, we've got plenty of time. It took a little bit longer than I thought, that one, but and I hope that this at least gives you cause to reflect on things. I don't know if there's any particular answer that's been portrayed there, but what I tried to do to bring out was two particular artists, an example of the relationship between production of art and the kind of mental kind of situation, and trying to see the connection between them. But it seems to me that the work of the artist is a very fragile existence. It's a very tentative one where there's an attempt to the work of the artist is somehow, it's a form of self-transcendence, it seems to me. It's a form of self-expression. Maybe the artists, I think, watching this could say themselves. But anyway, that was my perception, and I don't think that actually architecture itself is so different from that. And the tragedy, in some sense, of architecture is that we are paid to be architects through a percentage of the cost of the building, and therefore it is tied to building construction, and therefore it is tied to the client, and hence we find the problem of neon, the problem of working for a client who is deeply objectionable, and yet you need to get work into the office. How do you reconcile the world of art with the world of money? I think it's as problematic, to my mind, for the architect as it is for the artist. So there's a question from the Q&A, which says, could you provide more examples on how this mental status merge into architectural space design in real projects? Well, I don't think it's a question of real projects. I mean, a lot of projects that are done by architects don't get built. And I think the whole discourse is kind of connected in some sort of way. I mean, what I'm, I guess, trying to operate in is at a kind of meta level, trying to sort of think about things beyond the way in which most architects would think about them, trying to unpack some of these things. I don't know of any case in architecture of anybody who's suffered in the same way as the two individuals, Francesca Woodman and Kusama, that I was referring to early on, in terms of the production. But I think if we can understand some of those impulses that lead to the desire to design, it gives us more of a sense of what design itself is really about. I think a lot of this is very unself-conscious. In other words, people often are not aware of what they're doing in that sense, and we don't necessarily see that. I think we got a glimpse maybe from the diaries of Francesca Woodman, what was going on in her mind. But often this is a very intuitive thing that you don't necessarily express in some way. So I know in a way it's a very abstract meta-theoretical discourse about what are the sensibilities that inform the design impulse. What is it we're trying to do? Why are we sort of connecting in some way? And why are we architects, frankly, in the first place? Why are we designers and why are we artists? What is the role of art? And my suggestion is as much about some kind of self-condition, transcendence of the self, to working through different sort of questions and finding our place in the world. Whether we could necessarily see it in the building itself, it's difficult to say, but I think what Adorno is talking about is a kind of sensibility that should feed into the design of the artwork, a sensibility that is not tied by a particular style. And I was maybe trying to suggest that you could see as much in David Chipperfield as you could in Zaha the principles they're talking about. So it is operating on a meta level, and you don't necessarily see an articulation in a real building that is like that. But I would simply say is when you go into a space, I once on one occasion, one of my colleagues that when I was working in the UK described going to the Bauhaus as being like a religious experience to see this building in Dessau. And I personally, as I said, I lived there, and it was an amazing personal experience to be in this place as a kind of place of calm. It was really quite an astonishing experience to be in that thing. So I don't know whether we could literally find a connection with buildings. There is it's a metaphorical discourse, and that's how I'd leave that. But maybe someone would want to go and make a proposal of what they think it might have had evoked that feeling in people. But I certainly think that that is the aim of architecture in some senses, to try and get across in that way something. I think this is what cathedrals often do. You can go in those spaces and kind of lose yourself in some senses. That's, I guess, the aim of good architecture, to reach that point. There's a question from Liu Hui, maybe a little off topic. I heated an option that creative equals experience plus logic. What do you think about it? Is it right? That's actually a very good question, Liu. I think that's a very, very good question. I think that I've often said that it seems to me that architecture is born of these two conditions. It has to, if you go back to Vitruvius, the definition of what architecture is, firmitas, utilitas, venustas. Venustas means charm. Most people talk about beauty, but it's charm. But it's basically aesthetics, right? Firmitas is structural logic, and utilitas is functional logic. They're kind of logical things, right? And we could also think about environmental logic now. That's become an issue. We now say, no, so now we've got to think about sustainability and so on. So those are logical kind of questions. The building has to perform in that way. And there's another side of things, which is to say the aesthetic. I think also Deleuze makes the kind of contrast between the idea of a kind of representation, which is really what you're talking about in terms of the experience and so on, and the structural logic of something. He always contrasts the Renaissance as being this kind of the buildings of the Renaissance as being based on a kind of visual template of representation, and the structural logic of a Gothic cathedral. So I think that definitely does, it is precisely that. And I think in some senses, I don't know if I mentioned this in a particular course, but I think that in some ways, when you think about what role AI has, the most obvious one, I think, is in terms of logic. In other words, we know that ChatGPT is pretty good at logic. Now it's going to get better. It's not absolutely accurate, but it's going to get better. And that side of things, especially when we're dealing with complexity of an urban condition, and an urban situation is often extremely complex. I don't think the human mind can handle the complexity of those, but you often find the situation whereby, for example, I found out the Spacemaker discovered that the AI was going to come up with amazing responses that were much more logical than any architect could come up with, in a very similar way to how AI is much better at chess and Go. That's logical side is what AI is good at, and it's also pretty good at the aesthetic side. But that's really more where it's kind of learning from us in some senses, from our expression. But I think that's a good question. So the other question I got this. All right. So there's also from Yep. Bad day, Melancholia, good topic. Art, love, religion. And then a question from Yep. Are ideas towards a new Eucharist okay to pursue artistically? Yeah. Well, I mean, the Eucharist is obviously a very religious expression, right? And I think what Kristeva argues is that this kind of connectivity we get from love, from loving the other, is kind of similar to the kind of connection we get from a religious devotion and so on. And I think the idea of the Eucharist, of course, Eucharist is actually agape. That's actually the Greek word in some ways. And it's about this selfless devotion, openness to the other. So yes, I mean, but maybe we need to find a non-religious terminology to describe that. Maybe try and find a different word to Eucharist. But no, I think that's absolutely correct. That's the kind of thing that I think Kristeva is arguing exactly. There's another question here. If this melancholia is embedded in education, training, and the discipline, how can the field use this knowledge to continue challenging the research motivations to a larger understanding of the hope of mortality and time as part of our human condition? How about looking at disciplines that describe and formulate protocols for health, repair, balance of energy flows at a material level? A doctor physicist. Let me just repeat that. If this melancholia is embedded in education, training, and the discipline, how can the field use this knowledge to continue changing the research motivations to a larger understanding of the hope of mortality and time as part of the human condition? How about looking at disciplines that describe and formulate protocols for health, repair, balance of energy flows at a material level? A doctoral physicist. Well, you know, I think that's yeah, no, I mean, I think there's definitely there is potentially research that is to be made there. How could you get an architecture of well-being, and what would it be to generate that architecture of well-being? And I think some of the work that's going on in neuroscience, ANSA, architecture, neuroscience, the Association of Neuroscience and Architecture, it's called, is looking at that. How can architecture maintain that? How can it? And in the end, this has to be the question that, you know, that we hope that we're making a world that is a better place in which to live. But how do we understand what that is precisely, and how does it work? So I think that it's potentially a good area for academic research. The real problem about the profession, though, is that in a sense you don't have time for research. You know, everything is based on getting a commission in and doing the work. And in a sense, your main concern is to get the commission, whether you're competing against another architect and so on, and whether we have the time to do that. But I would say that implicitly, the work of Zaha precisely does that. You know, that's my opinion. If you've ever been to a building by Zaha, they're not always as successful as the other ones. They're not all so successful, but you get this sense of being lost in this space. I certainly felt this when I was working on this. Bernard Schumi invited me to New York, to Columbia, and I recall flying across the Atlantic, you know, and you arrive and you're jet lagged, you know, and he put me up fantastic in an Ian Schrager hotel, really beautiful hotel in New York, and you went into this kind of cocoon that you went into, and despite the jet lag and despite everything else, you were there, and in a sense, it was recreating the nirvana of the womb itself. If architecture can do that, it can provide that kind of memories of that lost paradise and provide this kind of space where it's kind of comforting and nurturing. I think that's precisely what architecture can do. Whether or not we need to necessarily study it through a particular kind of scientific discourses, or whether we work it implicitly into our work. But it seems to me that to go to an architectural space where you suddenly feel at home. And this was the point, I think, that Adorno was making about sensuous correspondence. The fact that we can adapt to any place, the fact that we can adapt to San Quentin or any prison, means that not that we don't need design, but rather there seems to be an urge in every human being to want to adapt, to want to grow into the space, the environment around them. And if that is the case, then it is the role of architecture and design in general to facilitate that process. So, I mean, in some ways, maybe you don't need to study it, but it really is talking about a sensibility towards design that will produce something that hopefully will be this kind of cocoon-like existence where we can be literally cocooned, enveloped in an architectural space, that it has that same effect on us. We've got 3 more questions. There's okay, hold a second. Then there's one. Does your look at Melancholia have a relationship to Einstein's space-time? No. Could it? No. I have not thought about it in that context. I don't know. No, I think I'll pass on that question. But if you could rephrase it, it might be useful. I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
Here,
So,
Neil, I can rephrase it.
oh, I see. Okay.
I mean, I rephrase it in the bottom if you want to read it.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Oh, I see. This is your question, right? Do you want to ask a question?
Oh, sure. I mean, I just basically why I brought up Einstein and space-time. I'll read the follow-up.
Yeah.
Einstein's deep understanding of the universe and the interconnectedness. We are all interconnected and trapped in our own time, but the creation of an idea, art, design, and architecture has the possibility to live beyond our lifetimes, influence many generations into the future. So we don't follow the life cycle of our creation. It lives beyond us. So is that also part of that melancholia?
Mm-hmm. No, just one comment. Since you mentioned the universe, there is a theory it's a theory of Hans-Georg Gadamer, who's a German, I guess, ontological thinker. And he has a notion, he draws upon Plato for this, and I don't think I go into Plato because it gets very complex. Well, let me just simply say, in Plato, there is an idea in that there's a story in Plato, I think it's Republic Book 10, The Vision of and this is a person who actually died and comes back to life. And what he talks about what he'd seen when he died, and he talks about how he'd seen the universe as the kind of harmony of different spheres. There are all these spheres turning round, and they each are generating sounds in a very harmonic way. So the whole thing is a kind of harmonic condition. Everything is based on a harmony and a resolution, and that is the nature of the universe, according to this story of The Vision of Earth from Plato. And Gadamer's idea is that we are born of the universe. This is actually very close to the notion of Cora, which I'm going to go into now, but we are born of elements of atoms in the universe. That's what we are in some senses. And then when we see something that is visually well designed, depending on how you put it, but just basically well designed, what it does is re-evoke this original moment where we kind of glimpse the kind of fundamental harmony, as it were, behind the universe. At least that's the theory. I'm not quite sure whether that holds water, but that's the theory that he puts up. So the idea is the universe, we are aspects of this. And of course, Memo Acton is continually making that same point, that we are just atoms from the universe, and we from atom to atom, from dirt to dirt, and so on. But the idea I mean, I think that let me just think about it a little bit more. Well, I think trapped in our own time is an interesting kind of concept. I think it's what I find interesting is that it often you get some pieces of architecture that are of their moment, right? And you know that they belong to a certain sort of moment. And of course, we've had different periods, different sort of paradigms, shall we say, that go through. And Adorno talks about the Baroque as a certain moment. And when you're in the Baroque, in the moment of the Baroque, I mean, the music, the whole thing is seen as a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, as he would say. All the details relate to the whole, and it's all part of the Baroque project, and they relate to the thinking going on at the time and so on. And then when you move out of that, it doesn't make much sense anymore, because you're into a different sort of paradigm, and therefore it seems like decadent. It looks like the over-the-top, icing on a sugary cake or something like that. So in some senses, we do lose that connection because it's resonating with cultural values at the time. But at the same time, you could say there's certain buildings that just simply seem to be totally timeless. I think the Taj Mahal was one example of that, which was kind of I went there, and I got to say that it's really strange because you have this absolute chaos going around the temple, but the temple itself is completely serene in some way. So you do get some things that are timeless, and some things that have their moment, and they're tied down to a particular moment. Interestingly, in that book Camouflage, I don't know if anyone's had a chance to read it, but I don't mention any buildings. There's nothing in there. I don't refer to any building. The only building that's mentioned is Adorno talking about Sharon's Philharmonie, and that's because he's talking about it. But I don't talk about buildings because I'm trying to think of what it would be a timeless sensibility, a sensibility that will endure, that will always feed in without actually articulating the particular expression. It's just the sensibility, and that sensibility would work within the paradigm of what is happening at the time, and should prove to be effective. So that was the intention there, not to leave the book itself as being timeless by not tying it to a particular building. Vasco, two questions on Vasco. Considering the impact of virtual reality and interactive design, how do these technologies influence the experience of melancholia? That's a good question. I think that I think interactive design is the easier one to respond to, and especially if I were to think about the model of that wasp and the orchid, the model of them kind of interacting in some ways, and that was I know that certain interactive designers have read the book and thought about it in terms of interactive design, and that's about a kind of like a mutation where the world is changing with you and is connecting with you. It's in an empathetic way. I mean, there is a kind of notion of empathy that is throughout this, and I'm not using the word empathy because it's the word used for the 19th century German architectural theory, artist theory, but it is similar to that, to empathy. And therefore, if a building can empathize by moving with you, then maybe. And I think that in some senses, maybe the other way to think about it is these kind of we were talking about them, was it yesterday, the idea of these companion robots. They empathize. They've learned to respond to you and whatever, learnt as it were, and people find them comforting in some senses. So I think there is that potential, and maybe also to say, we mentioned that the humanoid robots, and while they are ridiculous because they don't make any sense from some points of view, they make sense in terms of empathy and about connecting to people. So I would say that you can see that there, and in the end, whether or not it's a moving place or static, it's still the same argument. And whether it's a kind of physical space or a virtual space, it also makes the same sort of argument. So it could relate to either. And to my mind, I'd say maybe the world of AI, what it does potentially is throw us up options that actually potentially are better than the ones that we can think of, and therefore these options could lead to some kind of improved empathy relationship to the built environment. So there's another question, follow-up question from Vasco. Can virtual environments provide a space for introspection, catharsis, or exploration of complex emotions? And how might this shape our understanding of melancholic states? Yeah, that's kind of connected to the first one. Yes. I mean, I whether it's a virtual environment or an actual environment, I don't think it necessarily makes any difference, but certainly it could. And the notion of catharsis is an important one, where you live through certain things. I mean, I would just say that actually I didn't use that term, but that I think is what's happening when Julia Kristeva is talking about Christianity, and when people they take Holy Communion and they go through this whole weird ritual, you know. Well, it's weird to, I'm sure, to anyone not in the Christian church anyway, of mimicking and going through this experience symbolically by connecting with Christ. It becomes cathartic. You get over it. You work your way through that in some senses, and you work your way through all those situations. That's in some way why, you know, I think some people say that, you know, some of these kind of video games that can be very violent could lead to violence and things. And I would say, well, no, maybe they just kind of, people are working way through their violent things, and it's cathartic, they get it out of the way and they behave normally in actual life. But who knows? So I think there is something there to be said. The theme of catharsis. Yeah, I don't know. Melancholia, I've got to say, actually, maybe the person that in terms of architects, are there any melancholic architects? I don't know if anyone's ever heard Jan Kaplicki. Jan Kaplicki was a very, very talented Czech architect, but every time I heard him, he was kind of deeply melancholic. He didn't commit suicide. He died. He died a natural death. Actually, it was the day his child was born. It was an extraordinary moment. I guess there must be some melancholic architects who to compare to a melancholic artist. I don't know. I would love to know, and I don't know much about the world of art, but I'd love to know, has anyone done some research on this? And I guess maybe a simple Google search would reveal something. But how do we understand Kusama? I mean, the videos I showed you were talking about something, and there was real content there. There were real ideas, and you put it alongside Kristeva's thought about melancholia, how you need to be, in some sense, melancholic to be an artist, because you have to draw on yourself, look internally inside yourself. At the same time, you need the art to break out, to connect with the outside world. I think that's such an powerful idea, and I don't know if anyone has taken that further, but we're getting plenty of examples of mental health in terms of artists. It seems actually, I don't know, I mean, Van Gogh, of course, was someone who cut off his ear. I don't know why he cut off his ear, but, you know, he cut off his ear. And probably more examples of that in the world of art than there are in the world of architecture. But I might be wrong. Yeah. Anyway. Paul McCarthy. Is that? Oh, okay. I don't know this guy. Do you want to say who this guy is, Gustavo, or no?
Oh yeah, Paul McCarthy. He's a famous contemporary artist. He makes sculptures, spaces, and videos, and he was a professor at UCLA. In his work, you can see Melancholia, but you also see much of a critique on culture and technology. Yep, he would be a good person to interview.
Yeah, I think that, you know, when you're producing something, and actually, frankly, you can find this also in just straightforward things like working on Midjourney. Actually, it kind of, you lose yourself in it, and it kind of I mean, Benjamin makes the comment that thinking is intoxicating. You get lost in your thought. But there's also the comment that's made by Deleuze, that when a book forms a rhizome between you and the world, it forms a kind of connection. And I think that's what we're doing when we're designing, when we're drawing, whatever we're doing, reading or anything. It's that operation where you lose yourself in some senses, and it has, to some extent, some therapeutic value. I don't know. I would just leave that thought with you to think through in your own lives. Do you find yourself getting lost in this world of design, of art, and do you find yourself kind of some kind of reward or something benefit, some connectivity that comes out of this process, because certainly that's what I've experienced. When you're producing something, you can really kind of connect in some way and lose yourself in that kind of process. So I agree with Benjamin. I think it's not only intoxicating, it has this effect of actually kind of taking you out of yourself, a form of self-transcendence. And that itself is also, I guess, what the monks are doing. You know, the monks in their plain chant, it is a form of self-transcendence. They lost themselves in this kind of moment. I don't know who else has been writing about those things, but I was just picking up on the thinking of Kristeva, and they kind of connect in some way. And so the person I guess I didn't really speak about enough about was Deleuze, who is very much of that thinking, and the idea of how we use art or writing or philosophy as a way of kind of connecting, and everything ultimately he's talking about is about connectivities, and hence the book by John Rachman that is entitled Connections. How are we doing for time? We're almost 7 o'clock. I think we can wrap things up unless there are any final questions.
Nothing on YouTube. I think we answered everything.
Well, I don't think there are any answers today. I mean, I don't think that, and it's not really for me to provide the answers. I want everyone, I'm trying to provoke people to think about, you know, what is behind what we're doing and taking it to sort of a different level. What is it behind Kusama? I don't know. Francesca Woodman, who knows? But there's something that needs to be unpicked. And the way you see these works of art in these kind of commercial art fairs like Art Basel, where they're just treated as commodities, is so far from the way that the artists produced them. I mean, I guess because in Miami they have the Art Basel. You go around and you see these things, and they kind of, it's such an astonishing mismatch. You have the people who buy the art, who kind of flown in from New York and whatever, you know, the rich people. And then you've got the artists who've got absolutely no connection with those rich people. I mean, there are a few artists who get rich, but most are starving in the garret. And then there's another type in between, who kind of intermediaries, who are the kind of curator kind of people who are teaching the people about to buy the stuff about the work. But it's actually fascinating from an anthropological viewpoint to see these different tribes all operating in the kind of same space, as it were. But art is really extreme. I mean, the difference between the artist and the client is extreme. There's a question in Q&A here that let me just say, whoa, it's a long question. And I don't know who it is. It just says an anonymous attendee. The content of today's lecture reminds me of a chapter in a movie, Wes Anderson's The French Dispatch, 2020. This is an interesting plot. The painter Moses introduced himself to his cellmate. I have been here for 3,647 days and nights, and I have to stay for another 14,603 days. I drink 14 pints of mouthwash every week. At this rate, it is estimated that I have poisoned myself before I see the sky again. This really makes me sad. So I have to change my plan. I have to go in a new direction. I have to make my hands as busy as possible. So I signed up for the pottery and the basket interest class. My name is Moses. At the same time, the scene of the film cuts into the solemn and painful faces of other inmates, which seem to reflect other sensitive artists in reality. The sadness imprisoned by reality through art and love, although most of the time it is painful. Is this their spiritual way of breathing? Confine, understanding, puzzle solving, hope, spur, release. I'm curious of what this set of words will mean. It's been cut off. And maybe the word you reached your word cut. Yeah, I don't know. I think extreme conditions are always so interesting. That's why, you know, I think that the story about Nelson Mandela and the other people in the prison that I was talking about, how somehow you survive by entering into that logic. You've got to find a tactic to survive there. And their tactic was trying to bond with their cell, and it's interesting. What I didn't mention was I went around Robben Island, and Robben Island was where before he went under house arrest, Mandela was kept in a cell, and the people taking us around were themselves had been inmates there. It was really interesting, and the guy taking me around, I was picking up on all these things because I was writing about them, and he seemed sentimental about the place. And I said to him, I said, you seem incredibly attached to Robben Island. And of course, he was released then. He was a free person. It wasn't even a prison. It was just a kind of a museum, as it were, then. And he said, yes, in a way, I am. And this kind of points towards this extraordinary thing. And you can see another way this manifests itself is often you find this where people who've been through a certain experience, and though it's a painful experience, it becomes familiar and they're happy to repeat this. I mean, typically, the typical example of that would be someone who's been going out with the wrong person, some woman who's going out with the wrong man. It's so surprising how that person goes out with the wrong person, the wrong person, the wrong person. Because on one level, it's familiar and comforting, even though it's discomforting. So I think just to see all these things, I don't seen that movie, but I think it sounds kind of interesting. How do you develop strategies? How do you develop tactics to survive in these particular conditions? And how is it, in this, it seems to me that both Francesca Woodman and Kusama were living on the edge. And at some point, unfortunately, someone stole Francesca's bicycle and she didn't get a grant on the same day. It was a bad day, and that was it for her. And yet Kusama has somehow lived on. What is the difference between the two of them? And how do they, one survive and one not survive? But it seems to me that threshold moment about living on the edge is a very kind of significant one. On the one hand, some people in prison are forced to do that. They have to find strategies. But I would say that in some senses, you probably find people, a lot of very kind of artistic people are all living on the edge in that sense. I don't suppose there are many artists who have a kind of comfortable bourgeois existence. Most people are kind of in that sort of state of kind of mental anxiety, living on the edge the whole time. And maybe the creativity comes out of that adversity. I once heard a lecture by, and I forget her name now, but she's a very famous Egyptian feminist writer. And she was talking about this and how she was, when she was trying to get herself recognized as in a male-dominated world, it sounds exactly like Kusama's experience. How does a female Japanese artist manage to make her place in the West? Anyway, she said, I was producing art, but I was very poor. Then when I started making money and getting recognition, suddenly I couldn't do any more work. It was too easy in some senses. I wasn't living on the edge. And she'd put her money into a bank. Now, the story was that bank collapsed. She lost all her money, and suddenly she was able to work again. So it seems like a condition of productivity to actually be at that sort of threshold, at the very edge, living on the edge, in terms of those things. So maybe, I don't know. I mean, but that's I think I would like to see that movie. Yeah, it sounds interesting. Yeah. So okay. I think that's probably it. I think hold on a second. One more. Confine, understanding, puzzle solving, hope, spur, release. I'm curious about what this set of words will remind you of. Oh, I see. That's the follow-up from the previous one. Yeah. Well, I think all those words kind of relate in some sense to precisely what kind of I think the thinkers today and the artists were kind of alluding to. I think the notion of confine, let me just pick on the notion of confine, because, I think there's, in a sense, that's what architecture does at some level. What do you mean by confined? Does that mean restrictive or so on? I mean, Vitruvius makes this kind of comment that the wall is what led to society. That's what the wall led to society. It provided enclosure. It brought people together. The question, of course, is that in a way, the wall can also divide, or the wall can imprison. And I think that the question is not so much that, but the manner of the design itself, how it would work. So that's what I'm suggesting in some ways. It's not the confinement as such, because you can be confined. You are confined within the nirvana of the womb. That is a form of, but it's a form of protection as opposed to confinement. How can you find, whereas the tomb, for example, and I famously think of the case of, I wrote about there's a book called Architecture and Revolution about the Berlin Wall. And what was amazing about the Berlin Wall, it was built using breeze blocks, using actual building blocks that were used for buildings. And then they started sort of sealing up the houses by the wall. They bricked them up. And this seems to me astonishing. The very materials of architecture, that were designed to bring societies together, was used to kind of bring society to cause it to separate. And that, to my mind, is interesting kind of question. These two roles of architectural elements, and one is the tomb and one is the womb. And I would sort of say what we need to get towards is an architecture of the womb, an architecture that's nourishing, that is kind of giving us this gratification, this nirvana of the womb. And what that might be, who knows? But I have to say that I experienced it in this one hotel in New York when Bernard Shully invited me. It was an astonishing moment, just sinking blissfully into this environment. And you could see the social role for aesthetics. And there are these, if you look at some of the kind of the bars and designer spaces you find around the city these days, these are kind of aesthetic cocoons. They're absolutely based on this notion of a cocooning, of a kind of gratification, of comfort, of feeling at one, of a kind of harmony and so on. And it seems to me that is a kind of logic. And how do you translate into architecture? Well, you don't literally. I mean, but it as a kind of set of concerns at the back of your mind when you're thinking about what you're doing as a designer. If these are the kind of the principles, what you're aiming towards, that kind of sensibility is really what I was trying to articulate in the book Camouflage, and I think what is behind good design itself, this idea of trying to create the nirvana of the womb itself. At least that's what I would say. But yeah, thank you, Angela, your comments. Okay, I think we've had enough for today. Thank you for attending one more lecture tomorrow on belonging, and I hope this gives you thought. I mean, I'm not giving you any answers. I'm just asking you questions. Have you ever thought about this? And I think we need to unpack design itself. We need to unpack artistic production and see it not in terms of commercial real estate. See it not in terms of purchasing artwork as an investment or whatever, but see it in terms of the production itself and what people are trying to do to address their own condition in some senses through the production of it, and see it in those terms, to peel away this kind of commercial veneer and see it for what it is. Because I completely agree with Kristeva. I don't think that art is about making money. I mean, of course, artists have to make money, but the impulse is to contribute to society, to make an expression, to connect in some way. We live in a world where everything is tied to financial concerns, and of course, some cynical artists go along with that and try and exploit it for all it's worth. But the most artists, I think, are just not concerned about money. And I always like the notion of, musicians are like this, right? They would prefer to be busking on the subway, on the underground, than working as an accountant or something. And they're so passionate about their music, and they will do that. And that's the sensibility that I really like, where you're driven not by kind of money, which frankly means little in my view. I agree with the monks who taught me, but driven by your passion and wanting to share your passion, which I think we've often discussed this in Digital Futures. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to put together a platform where we can all share our passions. if I invite you to go to the pub, in England for a drink, you don't expect to be paid. No, you just go there because you want to have a conversation. It's not about being paid. And I think that is the discussion that we really need to get back to, how architecture can be a conversation where people can share their passion and where this community can grow together. And we can overlook the divides between rich and poor and try and bring these ideas, involve people from Bangladesh, everywhere, and be part of this conversation. So that's the aim of things. So I've spoken too much. Let me stop talking, otherwise I've gone forever. Thank you. Well, let's see you tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for the team, especially the team Digital Futures, putting this together, the hard work that goes into this. You don't know about it, but there's a lot of hard work that goes into it. Just as there's a lot of hard work that goes into the artwork. We don't know. We just see the artwork, but whatever. There's agony too. Thank you so much anyway. And also see you tomorrow. Thanks. Yep. Thank you.